The Gulf of Tonkin Incident. A pivotal moment in the Vietnam War. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, which occurred in August 1964, marked a significant escalation in the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. This series of events, involving alleged attacks on U.S. naval vessels by North Vietnamese forces, led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and the subsequent expansion of U.S. military presence in Vietnam. The incident and its aftermath have been the subject of extensive debate and analysis, highlighting issues of intelligence, political decision-making, and the broader context of the Cold War. In the early 1960s, the United States was increasingly involved in Vietnam, supporting the South Vietnamese government against the Communist North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong insurgency. This support included military advisors, economic aid, and covert operations. The Cold War context, with its global struggle between the US and Soviet-led blocs, framed the American commitment to preventing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox, a U.S. Navy destroyer, was conducting a signals intelligence patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam. The Maddox reported being attacked by 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. In the ensuing skirmish, the Maddox fired back, supported by aircraft from the nearby USS Ticonderoga. 1 North Vietnamese boat was damaged, while the Maddox sustained only minor damage. A second incident was reported on the night of August 4, 1964. The Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, were reportedly attacked again by North Vietnamese forces under stormy weather conditions. Despite conflicting and unclear reports from the ships involved, the U.S. administration, led by President Lyndon B. Johnson, treated these events as deliberate provocations by North Vietnam. In response to the alleged attacks, President Johnson addressed the nation on August 4, 1964, stating that the U.S. would take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against its forces and to prevent further aggression. On August 7, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution with overwhelming support. This resolution granted the President broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The resolution marked a turning point in the Vietnam War. It provided the legal basis for the escalation of U.S. military involvement, including the deployment of combat troops and extensive bombing campaigns. Over the next few years, the U.S. military presence in Vietnam grew dramatically, reaching its peak with over 500,000 troops by 1969. The Gulf of Tonkin incident has been the subject of significant controversy and reassessment. In the years following the events, it became clear that the reports of the second attack on August 4 were highly questionable. Declassified documents and communications revealed that there was considerable confusion and uncertainty about what actually happened that night. In 2005, a National Security Agency, NSA, historical study concluded that there was no attack on August 4, and the incident was largely the result of misinterpretations of radar and sonar readings, compounded by poor weather and high tension. This reassessment has led to widespread criticism of the Johnson administration for using the incident as a pretext for escalation without fully verifying the facts. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, and the subsequent resolution had profound implications for U.S. foreign policy and the Vietnam War. The escalation of the conflict led to significant casualties, widespread destruction, and deep divisions within American society. The war's unpopularity and the perceived deception surrounding the Gulf of Tonkin incident contributed to growing distrust in government, and the eventual shift in U.S. policy towards disengagement from Vietnam. The incident also had a lasting impact on U.S. military and intelligence practices. It highlighted the dangers of acting on incomplete or ambiguous information and underscored the need for rigorous scrutiny and accountability in decision-making processes. The War Powers Resolution of 1973, which aimed to limit the President's authority to commit U.S. forces to armed conflict without congressional approval, was in part a response to the experiences of the Vietnam War and the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin incident remains a pivotal and contentious moment in American history. It exemplifies the complexities of Cold War-era conflicts and the challenges of making informed decisions in high-stakes situations. The events of August 1964 and their aftermath continue to be studied and debated, offering lessons about the use of military power, the importance of accurate intelligence, and the consequences of political and military actions. As such, the Gulf of Tonkin incident is not only a key episode in the Vietnam War but also a critical case study in the broader context of U.S. foreign policy and military history. A Nation Rises. The Mozambican War of Independence. The Mozambican War of Independence, lasting from 1964 to 1974, was a prolonged armed struggle waged by the Mozambican Liberation Front, FRELIMO, against Portuguese colonial rule. This conflict was one of several liberation movements in Africa during the mid-20th century, which sought to overthrow European colonial powers and achieve national sovereignty. Mozambique had been a Portuguese colony since the 16th century. The Portuguese, motivated by economic interests and a desire to maintain their global empire, established a presence in Mozambique, exploiting its resources and integrating its economy with that of Portugal. By the mid-20th century, the Portuguese administration in Mozambique faced growing discontent and resistance from the indigenous population, who were subjected to harsh labor conditions, social discrimination, and economic exploitation. The Mozambican Liberation Front, FRELIMO, was founded in 1962 by exiled Mozambican nationalists in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Led by Eduardo Mundlin, FRELIMO sought to unite various anti-colonial factions and mobilize the population against Portuguese rule. The movement gained support from communist countries and other African nations, who provided military training, arms, and financial aid. The war began on September 25, 1964, when FRELIMO forces launched their first attacks in the northern province of Cabo Delgado. These initial assaults targeted Portuguese administrative posts and military installations, marking the start of a guerrilla warfare campaign. FRELIMO's strategy focused on undermining Portuguese control in rural areas, gaining support from the local population, and avoiding direct confrontation with superior Portuguese forces. As the conflict intensified, the Portuguese government responded with a substantial military buildup, deploying thousands of troops to Mozambique. The Portuguese strategy aimed to isolate FRELIMO by establishing fortified villages, known as aldementos, and conducting search and destroy missions. Despite these efforts, FRELIMO's guerrilla tactics and popular support allowed them to sustain their operations and expand their influence. FRELIMO also benefited from international support, receiving aid from the Soviet Union, China, and other communist countries. This assistance included weapons, training, and logistical support, which bolstered FRELIMO's capabilities and morale. Additionally, neighboring countries such as Tanzania and Zambia provided safe havens and bases for FRELIMO fighters. FRELIMO faced internal challenges during the war, including ideological divisions and leadership disputes. In 1969, Eduardo Mundlin was assassinated, leading to a power struggle within the movement. Samora Machel eventually emerged as the leader, emphasizing a Marxist-Leninist ideology and consolidating FRELIMO's control over the liberation effort. Machel's leadership brought a renewed focus on political education, social reforms, and mobilization of the rural population. FRELIMO established liberated zones in the north, where they implemented health and education programs, land redistribution, and communal farming initiatives. These efforts aimed to demonstrate FRELIMO's commitment to improving the lives of ordinary Mozambicans and gaining their allegiance. By the early 1970s, the Portuguese colonial empire was under increasing strain. The costs of maintaining colonial wars in Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau, coupled with domestic political and economic pressures, led to growing opposition to the regime in Portugal. The Carnation Revolution of April 1974, a military coup that overthrew Portugal's authoritarian government, marked a turning point in the war. The new Portuguese government, led by the Armed Forces Movement, the MFA, sought to end the colonial wars and negotiate a transition to independence for its African colonies. In Mozambique, negotiations between FRELIMO and the Portuguese government culminated in the Lusaka Accord of September 1974, which outlined the terms for a ceasefire and the establishment of a transitional government. On June 25, 1975, Mozambique officially gained independence, with Samora Machel becoming the country's first president. The transition to independence, however, was marred by challenges, including economic difficulties, social upheaval, and external pressures. The new government faced the daunting task of rebuilding a war-torn nation, and addressing the legacies of colonial rule. The Mozambican War of Independence had far-reaching consequences for the country and the region. It inspired other liberation movements in southern Africa, and contributed to the broader decolonization process on the continent. However, Mozambique's post-independence period was marked by internal conflicts, most notably the Mozambican Civil War, which erupted shortly after independence and lasted until 1992. The Mozambican War of Independence was a significant chapter in the history of anti-colonial struggles in Africa. It exemplified the determination and resilience of the Mozambican people in their quest for freedom and self-determination. Despite the challenges and sacrifices, the war ultimately led to the end of Portuguese colonial rule and the establishment of an independent Mozambique. The legacy of the war continues to shape the country's political, social, and economic landscape, highlighting the enduring impact of the struggle for independence. The Vorsked program. Pioneering human spaceflight. The Vorsked program, an initiative of the Soviet Union during the early 1960s, marked significant milestones in the history of human space exploration. It followed the Vostok program and consisted of two manned missions, Vorsked 1 and Vorsked 2. These missions showcased the Soviet Union's technological advancements and their capability to send multiple cosmonauts into space, perform extravehicular activities, or EVAs, and execute complex maneuvers. The Vorsked program was not only a technical feat but also a strategic move in the space race, demonstrating the USSR's prowess to the world. On October 12, 1964, Vorsked 1 was launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, becoming the first spaceflight to carry more than one crew member. The spacecraft, adapted from the Vostok design, was modified to accommodate 3 cosmonauts: Commander Vladimir Komarov, Engineer Konstantin Feoktistov, and Medical Dr. Boris Yegorov. This mission was revolutionary as it eliminated ejection seats to fit the crew, who wore lightweight flight suits instead of traditional space suits due to space constraints. The objectives of Vorsked 1 were multifaceted. To demonstrate the feasibility of multi-crew space missions. To study the effects of space travel on multiple human beings simultaneously. And to perform various scientific experiments in orbit. The mission was successful, and the crew completed 16 orbits around Earth in 24 hours and 17 minutes. Despite the cramped conditions and lack of space suits, the mission proved that human beings could work together effectively in space. This achievement was a major propaganda victory for the Soviet Union, occurring just days before the 47th anniversary of the October Revolution, reinforcing the USSR's image as a leader in space exploration. The Vorsked 2 mission, launched on March 18, 1965, was notable for another historic achievement: the first human spacewalk. The spacecraft carried 2 cosmonauts, Pavel Belayev and Alexei Launev. Launev's EVA lasted 12 minutes and 9 seconds, during which he exited the spacecraft and floated in space, connected by a 5.35-meter tether. Launev's spacewalk demonstrated the following key advancements: the ability to leave the spacecraft and perform tasks in the vacuum of space, the functionality and reliability of the space suit and life support systems in an EVA, and the psychological and physical effects of performing activities outside the spacecraft. Despite the successful spacewalk, the mission faced significant challenges. Launev's suit inflated in the vacuum of space, making it difficult for him to re-enter the airlock. He had to release some pressure from his suit, risking decompression sickness. Additionally, Vorsked 2 experienced re-entry issues, landing off course in the Siberian wilderness. The cosmonauts endured 2 nights in freezing temperatures before being rescued. The Vorsked program represented a significant leap in space technology and human spaceflight capability. The missions demonstrated the USSR's ability to innovate and adapt their spacecraft for more complex missions. The decision to fly without spacesuits in Vorsked 1 and the engineering required for Launev's EVA in Vorsked 2 underscored the Soviet commitment to pushing the boundaries of what was possible in space. Strategically, the Vorsked missions were a critical component of the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States. They were designed to achieve specific firsts that would bolster Soviet prestige and demonstrate their technological superiority. The successes of Vorsked 1 and Vorsked 2 were widely publicized, contributing to the perception of the USSR as the leader in space exploration at that time. Despite their achievements, the Vorsked missions faced numerous criticisms and challenges. The lack of space suits on Vorsked 1 was a significant risk, as it left the crew vulnerable in the event of cabin depressurization. The cramped conditions of the spacecraft also posed a challenge to the crew's comfort and safety. Vorsked 2's re-entry issues highlighted the difficulties of precise landing in manned spaceflight. Internally, there were disagreements among Soviet space officials regarding the direction and safety of the program. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer of the Soviet space program, had reservations about the modifications made to the Vostok spacecraft to accommodate multiple crew members. The political pressure to achieve milestones before the Americans often led to compromises in safety and mission design. The Vorsked program, despite its brief duration, had a lasting impact on the development of human spaceflight. It paved the way for more complex missions involving multiple crew members and EVAs. The experience gained from Vorsked 2's spacewalk was invaluable for future missions, including those of the Soyuz program and the International Space Station. The program also had a profound influence on the American space program. The successes of Vorsked 1 and Vorsked 2 spurred NASA to accelerate its Gemini and Apollo programs, leading to significant advancements in space technology and human space exploration capabilities. In retrospect, the Vorsked missions are seen as bold and daring steps in the early days of human spaceflight. They demonstrated the Soviet Union's willingness to take risks and push the envelope of what was possible, leaving a legacy of innovation and achievement that continues to inspire space explorers today. In conclusion, the Vorsked program was a pivotal chapter in the history of space exploration. It showcased the Soviet Union's technical prowess and strategic vision, achieving remarkable firsts in multi-crew missions and spacewalks. Despite the risks and challenges, the program's successes had a lasting impact on the trajectory of human spaceflight, laying the groundwork for future exploration beyond Earth's orbit. Conflict in the Caribbean. The Dominican Civil War. The Dominican Civil War, also known as the April Revolution, occurred in 1965 and was one of the most significant conflicts in the modern history of the Dominican Republic. This war involved a power struggle between factions that supported the return of Juan Bosch, the country's first democratically elected president, and the ruling military junta that ousted him in a 1963 coup. The conflict quickly escalated into an international crisis, drawing in the United States and several other nations. The war's origins stemmed from the political turbulence that followed the assassination of Rafael Trujillo, the Dominican Republic's dictator, in 1961. Trujillo had ruled the country with an iron fist for over 3 decades, and his death left a power vacuum that various political factions sought to fill. In 1962, the country held its first free elections in decades, resulting in the victory of Juan Bosch, a left-leaning intellectual and a member of the Dominican Revolutionary Party, the PRD. Bosch's presidency was marked by his attempts to implement a series of progressive reforms, including land redistribution, labor rights, and reducing the influence of the military. However, his policies alarmed the conservative elite, the military, and the Catholic Church, who saw them as a threat to their interests and as steps toward communism. In September 1963, Bosch was overthrown in a coup led by the military, and a conservative junta took control of the government. For nearly 2 years, the Dominican Republic was governed by a series of military and civilian regimes that failed to gain popular support. The economy deteriorated, and political unrest simmered as supporters of Bosch demanded his return to power. This set the stage for the civil war that erupted in April 1965. On April 24, 1965, a group of junior military officers and civilians loyal to Juan Bosch launched an uprising in the capital city of Santo Domingo. Their goal was to overthrow the military junta and restore Bosch to the presidency. The rebels, known as constitutionalists, quickly gained control of most of the capital, with widespread popular support from the city's poor and working-class residents. The ruling junta, led by General Elias Wessin y Wessin, responded by mobilizing the Dominican military to suppress the rebellion. The junta's forces, known as the Loyalists, were backed by the country's conservative elite, and were determined to prevent Bosch's return to power. The conflict quickly escalated into a full-scale civil war, with street fighting, artillery bombardments, and airstrikes causing widespread destruction in Santo Domingo. As the fighting intensified, it became clear that the constitutionalists were gaining the upper hand. By the end of April, they had taken control of most of the capital, and the junta's forces were on the verge of collapse. Fearing that a leftist government aligned with Bosch might emerge victorious, the United States decided to intervene in the conflict. The U.S. government, led by President Lyndon B. Johnson, was deeply concerned about the possibility of another communist regime emerging in the Western Hemisphere, especially in the context of the ongoing Cold War. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 had already established a communist government under Fidel Castro, and the U.S. was determined to prevent a similar outcome in the Dominican Republic. On April 28, 1965, President Johnson ordered U.S. Marines to land in Santo Domingo to protect American citizens and prevent what he described as a second Cuba. Over the next few days, thousands of US troops were deployed to the Dominican Republic as part of Operation Power Pack. The US intervention was officially presented as a humanitarian mission to restore order and protect civilians, but it was clear that the primary goal was to prevent the Constitutionalists from achieving victory. The presence of US troops in the Dominican Republic shifted the balance of power in favor of the junta. The Constitutionalists, despite their initial successes, were unable to defeat the combined forces of the Loyalists and the US military. The fighting continued for several weeks, but by May 1965, the Constitutionalists were forced to negotiate a ceasefire. The Dominican Civil War officially ended in September 1965, when a provisional government was established under Hector Garcia Godoy, a moderate politician acceptable to both the Constitutionalists and the junta. New elections were scheduled for 1966, and US troops remained in the country to oversee the transition. In the 1966 elections, Joaquin Balaguer, a former ally of Rafael Trujillo, won the presidency with US backing. Balaguer's victory marked the beginning of a long period of conservative rule in the Dominican Republic, which lasted until the 1990s. Juan Bosch, despite his earlier popularity, was unable to return to power, and his political influence waned in the years following the Civil War. The US intervention in the Dominican Civil War was highly controversial, both domestically and internationally. Critics argued that it was an unjustified interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign nation and that it undermined the democratic aspirations of the Dominican people. Supporters, however, contended that it was necessary to prevent the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere. The Dominican Civil War had a profound impact on the country's political and social landscape. The conflict revealed deep divisions within Dominican society, between the conservative elite and the working-class population, as well as between the military and civilian political forces. These divisions would continue to shape the country's politics for decades. The war also highlighted the extent to which the Dominican Republic was vulnerable to external intervention. The US involvement in the conflict demonstrated the extent of American influence in the Caribbean and Latin America during the Cold War, and it reinforced the perception that the region was a battleground for ideological struggles between the US and the Soviet Union. For the Dominican people, the Civil War was a traumatic experience that left thousands dead and caused widespread destruction. The memory of the conflict continues to resonate in the country's collective consciousness, and it serves as a reminder of the challenges of building a stable and democratic society in the aftermath of dictatorship. The Dominican Civil War was a pivotal event in the history of the Dominican Republic, marking a turning point in the country's political trajectory. It was a conflict fueled by the legacies of dictatorship, economic inequality, and Cold War geopolitics. Although the war ended with the establishment of a provisional government, and the election of Joaquin Balaguer, its impact on Dominican society and its implications for US foreign policy in Latin America would be felt for years to come. The Dominican Civil War serves as a stark reminder of the complexities of nation building and the challenges of achieving lasting peace and democracy in the face of external and internal pressures. Stepping stones to the moon. NASA's Project Gemini. NASA's Project Gemini was an integral stepping stone in the United States' journey to landing a man on the moon. Named after the zodiac sign symbolizing twins, this project was designed to develop space travel techniques necessary for lunar missions. Spanning from 1961 to 1966, Project Gemini was NASA's second human spaceflight program, following the success of Project Mercury and preceding the monumental Apollo program. Project Gemini was conceived in 1961, during the early years of human space exploration. After the success of Project Mercury, NASA needed to address several key challenges before attempting a moon landing. These included learning how to perform long-duration spaceflights, conduct extravehicular activities, spacewalks, and perfect the techniques of orbital rendezvous and docking. NASA's objective was to close the technological gaps that would make lunar exploration feasible. President John F. Kennedy's bold challenge to land a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s further emphasized the urgency of such a program. Project Gemini, with its series of two-man missions, was seen as a necessary precursor to the Apollo program, aiming to resolve the issues that Mercury could not. Gemini's mission objectives were ambitious and groundbreaking. The program set out to achieve several critical milestones. 1. Long-duration spaceflight. One of Gemini's primary goals was to demonstrate that humans could live and work in space for extended periods. Gemini 7 set the endurance record by spending nearly 14 days in space, proving that astronauts could survive the duration required for a trip to the moon and back. 2. Extravehicular activity, EVA. Gemini needed to test whether astronauts could exit the spacecraft and work in the vacuum of space. On Gemini 4, astronaut Ed White became the first American to conduct a spacewalk, marking a significant achievement in EVA training. 3. Rendezvous and docking. Perhaps the most crucial technique tested during Project Gemini was the ability to rendezvous and dock two spacecraft in orbit. This capability was essential for the Apollo missions, which would require the lunar module to rendezvous with the command module after landing on the moon. Gemini 6A and Gemini 7 demonstrated successful rendezvous maneuvers, while Gemini 8 saw the first successful docking of two spacecraft in orbit. 4. Re-entry and landing. Another vital aspect of Gemini was improving re-entry and landing precision. Unlike Mercury, which had limited control over its landing site, Gemini's missions practiced controlled re-entry, aiming for a more accurate splashdown target. This capability was essential for future moon missions, where precise re-entry would be critical for astronauts' safety. The Gemini spacecraft represented a significant technological advancement over its predecessor, the Mercury capsule. Designed to carry two astronauts instead of one, Gemini was larger, more complex, and capable of longer duration missions. The crew module was a conical-shaped capsule that housed the astronauts during the mission. It was equipped with life support systems, manual controls, and navigation equipment. Unlike Mercury, which required astronauts to remain in their seats throughout the flight, Gemini allowed them to move around the cabin to some extent, facilitating the longer missions. The Gemini spacecraft used the Titan II rocket as its launch vehicle, which provided significantly more power than the Mercury Redstone and Atlas rockets used during Project Mercury. Gemini also featured an onboard fuel cell system, allowing the spacecraft to generate electrical power during longer missions. Gemini's design included an airlock, allowing astronauts to conduct spacewalks. This feature, absent in Mercury, was essential for testing EVA techniques and equipment that would later be used during Apollo missions. Throughout its development, Project Gemini consisted of 12 manned missions, Gemini 3 through Gemini 12, each contributing valuable data and experience for future space exploration. Here are some of the most notable missions. Gemini 4, June 1965. Gemini 4 was NASA's second manned Gemini flight and featured the first American spacewalk. Astronaut Ed White's 20-minute EVA was a milestone in space exploration, although it revealed challenges related to mobility and the limitations of spacesuits in the vacuum of space. Gemini 5, August 1965. This mission demonstrated the feasibility of long-duration spaceflight. Gemini 5 set an endurance record, staying in space for nearly 8 days, and tested the fuel cells that powered the spacecraft, confirming that astronauts could remain in space for the duration required for a lunar mission. Gemini 6A and Gemini 7, December 1965. These two missions executed NASA's first successful rendezvous in orbit. Gemini 7 was launched first and spent nearly 2 weeks in space, while Gemini 6A launched later and rendezvoused with Gemini 7, performing a close approach maneuver. This mission marked a critical milestone in developing rendezvous techniques for the Apollo program. Gemini 8, March 1966. Commanded by Neil Armstrong, Gemini 8 achieved the first docking of two spacecraft in orbit with the Agena target vehicle. However, the mission also experienced a near disaster when a stuck thruster caused the spacecraft to spin uncontrollably. Armstrong's quick thinking and calm demeanor brought the spacecraft under control, demonstrating the importance of pilot skill in space missions. Gemini 12, November 1966. The final Gemini mission was commanded by Jim Lovell and featured a successful EVA by Buzz Aldrin. Aldrin's spacewalk was a significant improvement over previous EVAs, benefiting from better training and equipment adjustments. Gemini 12's success paved the way for the Apollo missions, ensuring that astronauts could work outside the spacecraft efficiently. Project Gemini's legacy is one of immense achievement and contribution to the broader goals of NASA's human space exploration. By the end of the program, NASA had successfully demonstrated that astronauts could endure extended spaceflights, perform complex EVAs, and conduct precise orbital maneuvers, all essential skills for a lunar mission. These achievements not only set the stage for the Apollo program, but also solidified the United States' position as a leader in space exploration during the intense Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. Moreover, Gemini fostered the development of technologies and techniques that would continue to influence space exploration for decades. The lessons learned from Gemini informed NASA's subsequent missions and contributed to the broader understanding of human spaceflight. In conclusion, Project Gemini was a crucial intermediate step between Mercury and Apollo, helping NASA bridge the gap between Earth's orbit and the Moon. The program's achievements, from spacewalks to rendezvous, proved vital in the eventual success of the Apollo missions. Gemini's legacy endures as a testament to the ingenuity, perseverance, and ambition that propelled humanity to explore the final frontier. Borderlines and battlefields. The Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. The Indo-Pakistani War of 1965 was a significant military conflict between the two nations, largely centered on the contested region of Kashmir. The war lasted from April to September 1965 and ended with a ceasefire agreement brokered by the United Nations. Despite its relatively short duration, the war had profound effects on both India and Pakistan, shaping their military strategies, foreign relations, and future interactions. Kashmir remained a flashpoint of conflict between India and Pakistan after the partition of British India in 1947. Both nations claimed Kashmir, and their first war over the region in 1947-48 had resulted in a ceasefire that left the state divided between them. However, the political and military situation in the region remained tense. In early 1965, the Rann of Kutch, a marshy region in the western part of the subcontinent, witnessed a series of skirmishes between Indian and Pakistani forces. Though these clashes did not escalate into full-scale war, they further strained the already volatile relationship between the two nations. Diplomatic efforts to de-escalate tensions were unsuccessful, and by mid-1965, both sides were preparing for a larger conflict. The war officially began in August 1965 when Pakistan launched Operation Gibraltar, an attempt to infiltrate Indian-administered Kashmir and incite an uprising against Indian rule. Pakistan believed that the Kashmiri population would support this operation and rise against Indian forces, but the plan did not go as expected. Indian forces quickly responded, leading to a significant escalation of the conflict. Pakistan followed up with Operation Grand Slam, an attempt to capture the strategic Aknor Bridge in Jammu, which was vital for India's supply lines in the region. This operation also met with limited success as the Indian army counterattacked, forcing the Pakistanis to retreat. Both countries then engaged in large-scale military operations along their international border and the line of control in Kashmir. The conflict soon expanded beyond Kashmir, with both nations launching air and ground assaults across the border. One of the largest tank battles since the Second World War took place in the Sialkot sector in September 1965, involving hundreds of tanks on both sides. The Indian Army's performance in the Punjab region and their capture of the strategic Hajipur Pass in Kashmir demonstrated their military capability and resolve. Similarly, the Pakistani military gained successes in areas such as Cham, where their forces were able to make significant advances into Indian territory. The air forces of both India and Pakistan also played crucial roles during the war. Pakistan's Air Force initially gained the upper hand with successful strikes against Indian targets, but the Indian Air Force soon recovered and began conducting operations deep inside Pakistani territory. Both nations suffered significant aircraft losses during the conflict, with their air forces achieving mixed results in terms of strategic impact. Naval operations during the war were limited compared to the land and air battles. The Indian Navy primarily focused on protecting its coastline and merchant shipping, while the Pakistani Navy sought to disrupt India's sea lines of communication. Although naval engagements were minimal, they were important in maintaining logistical support for both countries during the conflict. The Indo-Pakistani War of 1965 took place against the backdrop of the Cold War, with both the United States and the Soviet Union closely monitoring the situation. Both superpowers had strategic interests in the region, but neither wanted to see the conflict escalate into a larger war that could destabilize South Asia. As a result, both the United States and the Soviet Union pressured India and Pakistan to seek a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The United Nations also played a key role in brokering a ceasefire between the two nations. On September 22, 1965, under heavy international pressure, both India and Pakistan agreed to a UN-mandated ceasefire, bringing an end to the fighting. The war officially ended with the Tashkent Agreement, signed on January 10, 1966, in the presence of Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin. The agreement required both sides to withdraw to their pre-war positions and restore the status quo. Although the war ended in a ceasefire, neither side could claim a decisive victory. Both India and Pakistan suffered heavy casualties, with thousands of soldiers killed and wounded, and significant material losses in terms of tanks, aircraft, and other military equipment. However, the conflict did not lead to a clear resolution of the Kashmir dispute, which remained a contentious issue between the two countries. For India, the war demonstrated its growing military strength and the resilience of its armed forces. The war solidified the leadership of Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri, who had taken over after the death of Jawaharlal Nehru in 1964. Shastri's slogan, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, Hail the Soldier, Hail the Farmer, became a rallying cry for the nation during and after the war. Although he passed away shortly after the signing of the Tashkent Agreement, Shastri's leadership during the conflict left a lasting legacy in Indian politics. For Pakistan, the war had mixed results. While the Pakistani military had initially hoped to achieve a swift victory in Kashmir, the conflict instead highlighted the challenges of waging war against a larger and better equipped adversary. The leadership of President Ayub Khan was questioned in the aftermath of the war, and internal dissent within Pakistan grew as a result. The war also strained Pakistan's relations with its allies, particularly the United States, which imposed an arms embargo on both India and Pakistan during the conflict. The Indo-Pakistani War of 1965 had several long-term implications for both countries. It underscored the importance of military preparedness, and the need for modernization of their armed forces. Both nations undertook significant efforts to enhance their military capabilities in the years following the conflict. Diplomatically, the war highlighted the limitations of international mediation in resolving deeply entrenched conflicts. Despite the efforts of the United Nations, the United States, and the Soviet Union, the Kashmir dispute remained unresolved, and tensions between India and Pakistan continued to simmer. The war also reinforced the idea that the two nations were locked in a cycle of conflict, with Kashmir as the central issue that would continue to drive their hostilities. The Indo-Pakistani War of 1965 was a pivotal moment in the history of South Asia. While it did not resolve the Kashmir dispute, the war had lasting effects on the military, political, and diplomatic landscape of the region. The conflict highlighted the deep-seated tensions between India and Pakistan and demonstrated the difficulty of achieving peace in a region marked by historical grievances and territorial disputes. Although the war ended with a ceasefire and the Tashkent Agreement, it set the stage for future conflicts between the two nations, particularly the 1971 war that would lead to the creation of Bangladesh. In the next chapter, we will explore the new order in Indonesia, as well as the Chadian Civil War, and the Soviets reach another milestone in the space race, with the first soft landing on the Moon's surface.